one thing that's been talked about, and I've heard you mention it too, and I think I just kind of want to challenge it a little bit, not a lot, but a little bit, because there's a lot of truth to what you've said many times and others say all the time. It's that, cumulative inflation. If you look at over the last, 3 years or so, it's up about 22%. And the idea is that, sometimes you hear people say silly things like, hey, if only prices could go back down to the levels where they once were, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, if only we could experience those types of prices again. And that's just not going to happen, at least not on average, right? Like inflation, it almost never decreases. The rate of inflation just goes down, right? So we've noticed that the rate of inflation has come down a little bit, but we're not going to experience the prices from 3 to 4 years ago. Like that we would actually have to have deflation for that. And, a recession is typically what precipitates a deflationary period. So most of us don't want a recession. So we're not going to experience the prices from back then. So that's a very real thing. But at the same time, sometimes people think that just because inflation is going up on average, every good and service is also more expensive. And, one of the things that, I don't want to get on a conversation on the topic of eggs again, because I know we probably spent a little bit more time than we needed to on that. I think it was either the last podcast or maybe 2 podcasts ago. But if you look at like the items that the St. Louis Fed tracks, whether it's eggs, milk, cheese, whatever those items are, like it actually ebbs and flows. Some of those items, like they do get more expensive over time, and they do represent like exactly like if inflation, like I think in October it was announced that it was 2.6% or something like that. It doesn't mean that everything goes up by 2.6%. Like for instance, used cars, like you and I were just talking about this, like that number might be artificially low because used cars are pulling the overall inflation figure down. So like if you think about what happened during COVID, we had some serious supply chain disruptions, right? And it actually caused used cars to be insanely expensive during the pandemic. Part of that was like, I think both you and I know people who had already ordered and paid for a new vehicle, but they had to wait forever to get that car. And then in some cases, they ended up selling the car that they got for an absurd amount over what they paid. Like, I think you have a few friends that maybe did that, right?
I do. Yeah, absolutely. I've got a couple buddies that they bought a car, put the first 10,000 miles on it and made 20 or 30 grand just because you couldn't get the car that they had, so they were kind of living the dream. And a couple of those guys did it a couple times. They'd buy the newest model the first year, they pre-ordered it, got it, put on 5 to 10,000 miles, sold it 20 to 30 over, rolled that money into the next new car. So it was a pretty good gig for those that saw what was coming and maximized it.
Yeah. And so I ended up buying a 2020 Ram 1500 and I put about 27,000 miles on it before I sold it back to the dealership for exactly what I paid. So it was kind of a weird time, but one of the things that you look at today, out of the 80,000 goods and services that the Bureau of Labor Statistics tracks, like that is one of those figures, used car prices, and year over year, they're down about 10%. Right. So if you look at the latest inflation report that we received, like used car prices are actually dragging that number down, but eventually prices are going to normalize on used cars. So like if you consider, if you were to look at used car prices and eventually they normalize and everything else stays the same, if all things remain equal after that, the actual inflation figure, the average might be quite a bit higher than that, So yeah, it's one of those things that, when I consider what actually affects my purchasing power, it's not just, there's a lot of things that could affect the price of things. And it's, in some ways it's economics 101, right? When the demand for something exceeds the supply, price has to go up, just like they did with used cars. But there's other things too, the cost of distribution, the demand by the end user. And of course, inflation could play, a huge role in all of that, the cost of production. But that's why we actually see that, depending on each specific good and service, you can see that it does ebb and flow. Sometimes it goes up, sometimes it goes down, like insurance on vehicles, for instance, like that's up, I think like 14%. If we look at the October inflation report. So there's a lot of things to consider. And I think that, as we kind of go into, what retirees can do and the steps that they can take to help mitigate inflationary losses, if you will. There's a lot of things to consider, and I don't think most people have the time to go through each of these things. They just know that, hey, whatever talking head they listen to on the news, like that person is telling them that inflation is up, inflation equals bad, and they don't really consider, real wages or maybe how they spend their money, or the fact that, the market's been up over the last 2 years. And that actually makes a difference too, in their overall standard of living and what they can afford to do in retirement.
I think the biggest thing too that we see is, we're helping people pull off a certain amount of income from their investments every month. And I'd say the last year, out of the 12 years that I've been in the financial services business, I've had more people call and say, hey, you're sending me $2,000 a month. Can you bump it to 2,500 or $3,000? Hey, you're sending me $5,000 a month. Can you bump it to 6 or 7? So we're seeing people feel the pinch, and it's requiring them to draw down heavier on their investments, than they did for years. And one nice thing is, when you have years like the last 12 months where the market's up, so they can pull more and their accounts are still growing. When it's really difficult was in 2022 when costs were going up and people's portfolios were going down. That's a difficult situation. Some of the stats I'll just read off for seniors that they're complaining about is 66% of them surveyed by Greenwald Research said that they are going to run out of money, or they're concerned, that they're going to run out of money in retirement, which is up 6% or 10% from 2023. 33% of 55-year-olds and 43% of 65-year-olds have postponed retirement due to inflation. We've got several couples and individuals that we're working with, and they've said, man, my plan was to retire at 65, but I'm going to wait till 67 now. Many of them have said, hey, we've got mounting debt, and I'm concerned about what's going to happen in the market. I'm going to work 2 more years just to see what happens here, just out of a sense of peace of mind. And then 35% of retirees are withdrawing from savings or investments in the last 12 months in response to inflation. And I think one of the things y'all say that we've seen, really since I'd say 21, is we have more people that are drawing on retirement assets, but they're not retired yet because their income hasn't caught up. But they're just pulling an extra 500 or 1,000 or 1,500 a month from the portfolio just to pay for the expenses. And we've really not seen that before.
Yeah. And one thing to kind of piggyback off one thing that you said, and maybe just because, I've been like labeled the pessimist in our office, but I think everybody should postpone retirement. Why take a chance? And here's my thinking. People don't realize like how much good does an additional year or 2 of staying in the workforce, like how much good would that do for your portfolio? Well, there's a couple of things that it does. Not only are you bringing in more income that you wouldn't have otherwise had, you're also not, in most cases, beginning to take distributions on that portfolio. So like you're withholding those distributions, you're not taking them, and you're probably actually contributing. So now not only do you have more income, you've also not started drawing on your portfolio, but you're probably making those contributions and maybe taking advantage of an employer match. Like what's not to like, right? Of course, the challenge is like that I think that most people have is, they've already committed, they already have a date in mind. They know that they want to retire on November 16, 2025 or 20, whatever that is. And just to readjust and to have an honest conversation, it probably wouldn't kill you to keep working. But sometimes when you've committed to that, it's kind of like, I don't know. I think it's just difficult for people to do.